Mistresses, who regularly disciplined their own maids, also usually had similar rubber aprons in their wardrobes, because they were well aware of the effect the sight and sound of these aprons induced. In school, young girls had lessons on the subject, including practical demonstrations, included under household management. After 10 very long minutes, Miss Cox came for me. When I was released and stood up, she approached with the leading chain with the clips on the ends. Greatly daring, I risked saying, "Please, Mississippi. You promised that if I obeyed you without any fuss, you wouldn't use those clips on my nipples on the return journey." "And I always keep my promises, as you will find out," she said, clipping the ends of the chains to my new nipple rings instead. At least, she did take off the cups from my heels. She made me curtsy my thanks to Miss Windsor and then led me out. When we got to the ground floor, she opened a door and led me onto the parade ground. Most of the marked-off areas now were filled with uniformed maids busily scrubbing away as though their lives depended upon it. Their lives did not, but the state of their behinds did. As we got closer, I saw that they were all wearing plain-colored dresses made of rubber, mostly blue ones, but several green. I was clearly not the only male maid in training at the moment. These dresses were turned up at the back and fastened with Velcro strips. They all had white rubber housemaid aprons on and rubber mop caps. A number of black-clad trainers were strolling amongst them and encouraging their efforts with switches and straps. Miss Cox took me towards a solitary figure who was wearing a brown rubber dress. Her scrubbing brush was much larger and thicker than those the other maids had, and it seemed that far more of an effort was needed to use it. Miss Cox ordered her to stand up, which she did stiffly and with difficulty, and then waited. I was then ordered to pick up the brush. My God! It was so heavy. Apart from the bristles, it was made entirely of lead. "What is your name?" asked Miss Cox. "Mary, miss." "Now, Mary, you are to take your brush and hold it above your head." Mary obeyed. It was obviously an effort. "Why are you on the punishment squad, Mary?" "My mistress sent me here for a month, plus an extra 2 weeks. She says I was becoming impertinent and lazy as my sentence got close to its end." "So lazy and impertinent, Mary, you now have had 5 years added to your sentence?" "Yes, Mississippi." "Well, you lazy little slut, I want you to run on the spot in double time for 200 steps and to continue to hold your brush in position. Then you can get back to your scrubbing." Mary began to run. Her arms and shoulders would be in intense agony long before she finished. We then went towards the far corner, where a squad of 8 girls was being drilled. They were basically dressed like me, with some additions. They wore heavy-looking boots and had bells attached to their nipple rings, which tinkled as they drilled. Each girl had a very heavy leather pack on her back, and a strap from the bottom of it passed round her chest under her breasts, and the weight made the strap cut into the underside of her breasts. They were all breathing heavily and sweating profusely. There were 6 brown aprons and 2 pink ones. Pink aprons? Surely males wore pink aprons, but these members of the squad had breasts like the brown aproned ones? Miss Cox saw that I had noticed this and said she would explain when we got back to my room. She added flippantly, the bells wouldn't tinkle properly if they didn't have tits to hang from. We headed back past Mary, who was now violently trying to catch up with her work. In vain. As we got close, her instructor reached her and exclaimed, "Is that all the progress you have made, you lazy cow? No wonder your mistress sent you here for being lazy. This means another 2 weeks on the squad for you, apart from what you are going to get now. Kneel and bend over." She began to thrash Mary's already badly wheeled buttocks, as Mary wept piteously. "Please, miss," I pleaded with Miss Cox, "can't you save her from that extra punishment by explaining that we disturbed her work?" That was a cop-out if ever I heard one. You still haven't got the hang of things yet, have you, Shirley? What is she on? The punishment squad, Mississippi. Why is she here on the squad? Because her mistress sent her to be punished. And that is exactly what I and my fellow instructor are doing, so what is your problem? As we walked off the parade ground, I could see 3 months ahead of me full of tired aching muscles with a daily, newly thrashed arse. Plus the other diversions I had been shown. My hope, at the end of the 3 months, was that I passed all my proficiency tests as a maid and was sent to a mistress more interested in a neat and tidy house than in tormenting her maidservants. I hadn't had time to consider yet that any mistress happy to choose, or accept, a male as a maid would also almost certainly have a kinky and sadistic disposition. Just before we reached my room, she touched a button on her belt and so Susie was waiting when we got there. Susie dropped a very respectful curtsy. Miss Cox now said to me, "I told you I would explain about the boy maids with tits. You remember that you didn't have the usual facial hair when you woke up this morning?" I nodded agreement. "Well, that is because of a drug you were given. A daily dose of it also has the effect of your developing natural breasts over a period of several weeks. You will also find your voice getting higher pitched. You won't exactly become a soprano, but it will sound more feminine, to suit your new status. Any questions so far?" "Yes, Mississippi. When the daily dose ceases, after I finish my sentence, will my body return to normal?" "Theoretically yes, but we don't know for sure, because it has never been tested." I then said in a horrified voice, "But what happens when I do finish my sentence? Other boys must have finished theirs by now. What happened to them?" "You haven't been paying much attention to what has been happening today, have you, Shirley? If you are as inattentive as this during your training, you are going to have a much rougher time than usual." "I have been paying attention, miss, I promise, but I still don't understand." "Well, first of all, Miss Jacobs told you quite clearly that being sent to the punishment squad would add extra time to your sentence, didn't she?" Again I nodded. "Now think about that girl Mary we spoke to outside. What did she say she had been sent here for?" "She said she had been lazy and impertinent to her mistress, miss." "That is where you are wrong. She said her mistress had said she had been impertinent and lazy. There is a big difference." She turned to Susie and snapped, "When we came in just now, you forgot to curtsy to me, you slut." I knew this was untrue and so did Susie, but she didn't protest her innocence. "Hold out your hand." Susie held out her left hand and Miss Cox slashed her crop across the palm 3 times. "Change over." Susie held out her right hand and got another 3. "Now do you understand? Susie has been officially punished for disobedience, although we all know that she didn't forget to curtsy. It's not what servants do, but what we say they do that counts officially." So Mary's mistress said she had earned a visit to the punishment squad, which has also added another 5 years to her sentence, and it is the bad report which matters, whether it is strictly true or not. I burst out, "But why? That's not fair." "We don't care about it being fair, or not, but try looking at it from our point of view. Little Susie here has been out of her training for only a month and look at what a good little maid she is already. Now look at yourself. You are meekly standing there in a tiny green apron, which you tied on yourself without any protest just now, but only this morning I had to flog you to make you put the other penny on. If that is what we can achieve in such a short time, just think what superb maids you will both be after 5 years of training. You must also consider that, after living as obedient, subservient maids for 5 years, would you be much use in your previous lives and jobs?" It was at this point that I realized that the whole thing was a sham. We had not been sentenced to 5 years indentured servitude, but tricked into lifelong slavery. Legree Luxury Holidays had never been a holiday firm, but were modern-day slave traders. I had walked so trustingly through their doors and had, in fact, paid them a fee to enslave me. Now, too late, I remembered where I had heard the name Legree before. Simon Legree was the name of the cruel, sadistic slave owner in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. The warning had been staring me in the face all the time. Now I have some news for both of you. In about 3 months' time, Miss Jacobs is moving away on promotion and I will be taking over her job as principal. And, as principal, I will be entitled to 2 personal maids of my own, and I think I am going to choose you, Shirley, as my second. You and Susie are much of a height, one blonde and one brunette, and I think you will make a well-matched pair once your tits have completed their development. I can already see you both serving at one of my staff tea parties in fishnet stockings and high heels, brief mini-skirts and tiny frilly caps and aprons. I think you will both be very cute dressed like that, don't you agree, Susie? You have already had the experience. Susie gave a little grimace behind Miss Cox's back, and I gathered that it had not been a very happy experience for her. Of course, I was eventually to find out why. Apart from serving her guests, we also provided the cabaret for the parties, in that we would both be flogged, or punished in some other way, for their amusement. Come to think of it, I might even make Shirley grow a beard to go with the frilly uniform. This comment caused a shiver to run down my spine. God, please spare me that additional embarrassment. So, my hopes of getting an easygoing mistress at the end of my training were already shot to pieces. Now to get you dressed in your training uniform. First was a brassiere with the cups padded out to what was expected my new breasts would end up looking like. When you get breasts, these cups will have pins in them. They replaced the belt and uncomfortable crotch strap with an agonizingly tight corset, with a similar crotch strap. As Susie pulled the corset strings tight, Miss Cox told me that, if there were any sight of skin between the two edges of the corset, both Susie and I would be caned. Her for lack of effort and me for disobedience and non-cooperation. Smaller and smaller corsets would slowly replace the present one that already seemed impossibly tight. Next came a pair of tiny, very tightly stretched rubber knickers, reminiscent of baby pants. Then they put me into a green rubber dress. It was at least one size too small, and I had to be shoehorned into it. It fastened with a zip up the back, and this pulled in the dress above my waist skin tight. The high collar of the dress was made of several thicknesses of rubber, which made it like a posture collar. The skirt was quite loose and flouncy. Next was a white apron made from cotton-backed rubber, which gave the appearance of a starched housemaid's apron. All the straps, the waist strap and those over my shoulders, were pulled as tight as possible, and there was no stretch in these, which made the apron very tight and uncomfortable, before I even started to work in it. Then a rubber cap, similar to the housemaid's style one I had worn earlier, was put on my head. However, this one was not pinned to my hair, but had a sort of drawstring incorporated in it. This string had 2 nobler lumps in it, which rested on the sensitive spots on each of my temples. Miss Cox pulled the string as tight as possible. I now had so many areas of discomfort that, as I tried to ignore each one, another took my attention. This waterproof apron was very suitable as a training apron. It looked and rustled very similar to a well-starched housemaid's cotton apron. Later, when I was trained and had been put out into service, I discovered that many mistresses chose to uniform their maids with rubberized aprons rather than starched cotton, because they spent so much time scrubbing floors, cleaning windows, and being at the wash tub or the kitchen sink. No mistress ever wasted money on a washing machine or dishwasher when they had a rubber apron made on hand with, or without, a pair of rubber gloves. Incidentally, I also found that a mistress sometimes caned her maid over her rubber knickers, to save time if she was in a hurry. She had no idea if the pants gave some protection from the cane or not, but usually added 2, 3, or 4 strokes to the punishment just to be on the safe side and to make sure. However, they never caned over the rubber gloves. I saw my new reflection in the mirror, with the apron bib now pushed out and neatly rounded over my breasts, plus the fact that it was also nipped in at the waist. I realized that this more feminine look was what had been missing when I had compared myself with Susie earlier. Once more, a wave of humiliation and embarrassment overwhelmed me, as I blushed beetroot red. I stood there in considerable mental and physical discomfort waiting for what was to happen next. Miss Cox explained, once more, that the apron was our symbol of servitude and that one was to be worn at all times. The penalty for being caught apronless was a very severe flogging indeed. I asked about instructors wearing aprons, if they too were symbols of servitude. Of course not, stupid. That is quite different. That is a matter of keeping their uniforms clean or dry. You will soon get to know the difference. Now fetch me your cane. I brought it to her, remembering to offer it properly to her right hand. I'm now going to let you experience your first-hand caning like Susie just had. 3-handers, by the way, means 3 on each hand, and not 3 in total, and that's what you are going to get now. Between them, Miss Cox and Susie demonstrated to me the proper way to hold my hands out for them to be caned. The hand had to be parallel to the floor and the palm perfectly straight and not cupped. If the hand was moved, resulting in an imperfect stroke, the stroke was repeated. If you moved your hand away, so that the cane missed it, the stroke was repeated and another one added. Eventually I stood with my right hand out in the approved manner, waiting anxiously for the first stroke. One major difference between this and having your arse caned is that you can watch the cane being lined up, which heightens the tension as you can gauge the possible strength of the stroke. I could see at once that Miss Cox intended the first stroke to be a memorable one. It was. She put her whole body into it and the cane whistled down and it hurt almost beyond belief. I had to snatch my hand away, but fortunately for me it was after the stroke was completed, so it counted. But it took a great effort of will to put my hand up again for the next stroke and leave it still without flinching away. I somehow managed it and also for the third stroke. The cane had produced 3 agonized cries from me and the tears were streaming down my face. Now I had to suffer 3 more on my left hand. Finally I was sobbing my heart out and, pretending to complain about the noise I was making, Miss Cox produced an adult-sized replica of a baby's dummy, which she forced into my mouth. It was held in place by a strap and was giant-sized both in respect of the large teat inside my mouth and the piece outside my mouth, which covered most of my chin. It was also very uncomfortable to wear, but it did shut off my noise. Although this was the first hand caning I had ever received, I had instinctively taken up the standard position used by schoolchildren over the centuries, who had had their hands caned. I tucked my hands under my armpits in order to try to get some relief. "Put your hands down and stand to attention," snapped Miss Cox. I obeyed immediately, not wanting any more handers, and pressed the aching palms to the soft smooth rubber of my apron in an attempt to soothe them. It didn't help much. Miss Cox hung the cane back on its hook behind the door and went out. As she shut the door, the cane rattled on it and I guessed that was why the hook was placed here. Every time the door opened, or shut, you were reminded of the cane's existence. Once again, I stood regarding my reflection in the mirror, this time in full housemaid's uniform. With my new shape, albeit artificial for the moment, it now looked properly feminine. As before, my glance moved over to my cane and, once more, I could hardly believe the pain it had produced on my hands. I remembered my earlier resolve to obey all orders in order to avoid punishment, but both Susie and myself had just been punished for nothing and I now realized that the resolve was totally irrelevant. We could be caned or strapped for fun, their fun that is. I had now stopped crying, but was dribbling down my apron bib instead, because of the dummy. I waited and waited. Then there were footsteps outside and Miss Cox and Miss Windsor entered. I was very relieved to see that the latter was not wearing her yellow apron, but saw that she had the whalebone switch back on her belt. Miss Cox spoke. "You have already met Miss Windsor and she is going to be your trainer here." Miss Windsor gave me a scornful glance and then went over to Susie, who curtsied apprehensively. "Hello, little Susie. I hope you haven't forgotten me." She reached under Susie's apron bib and gave both nipples a viscous tweak. Susie squeaked, but stood perfectly still. "Good girl," Miss Windsor said, and then slapped Susie hard on both cheeks. Susie didn't move again. Miss Windsor then turned to me. "As you might have guessed, I was Susie's trainer as well and now you know something of what to expect and the sort of standard I will expect from you. Have you ever scrubbed a floor before?" "No, miss," I stuttered. "Well, don't let that worry you. Susie hadn't when I started with her and yet she was up to Olympic standard at the end of her training. I have every expectation that you will be the same. You know surely, some girls are natural material for maid servants, like Susie here, and, believe it or not, Charlie, some boys are too. And I think you are one of them." That was the last time I was ever to be called by my real name. "Well, now let's get started." Curtsy a temporary goodbye to Miss Cox. I obeyed. She removed my dummy and a pair of bright pink rubber gloves was added to my uniform. Then she came towards me with an ordinary dog's lead. I was very glad that my nipples were inaccessible, but she clipped it to my new nose ring, which was just as bad. It was plain from the contemptuous look on her face that she classed me on a level of a dog and not a favorite pet dog at that. She tugged on the chain, gave my bare calves 2 slashes from her switch and said, "Follow me, Shirley." The cuts from her cane and the words were quite unnecessary, as I had no option but to follow the painful tugs on my still tender nose. We left my cell and, as we walked along the corridor, I was made to stand aside with my back against the wall as a small party of schoolgirls, about 8 or 10 years old, came the other way. The girls, obviously from a select private school by their expensive uniforms, were on an educational visit to my school. A future generation of maid-owning mistresses was obviously being cultivated. When they got close, they suddenly realized what my gender was and they stopped, giggling, for a closer inspection. Miss Windsor snapped at me, curtsied to the young ladies and showed them some respect. I obediently sank into a low curtsy, and when they looked across at the comic figure I presented in my housemaid's uniform, with my scarlet cheeks under my maid's cap, the giggling changed to hoots of mocking laughter. I expect most of them came from homes that had a staff of feminine maids and that I was possibly the first male maid they had ever seen. The sight of a man dressed in a cap and apron making a humble curtsy to them sent them into hysterics. At this point, I completely understood the term shameclad and was mortified with humiliation. Their teacher and Miss Windsor both had broad grins on their faces at my intense embarrassment, and I saw the teacher give a knowing wink. This meeting had obviously not been an accident. She said to her class, "Right girls, you have had your fun. Now let's get on with our educational tour." They finally carried on their way, with probably one or two resolving to follow in the career footsteps of Miss Windsor. I wondered if any of them had considered the possibility that, sometime in the future, they might, just might, fall foul of authority and find themselves back in this training center, being called skivvy, wearing the wrong uniform and being on the wrong end of a cane? Miss Windsor finally allowed me to rise from my deep curtsy, and I sighed with relief, as it had been very uncomfortable with the long thick butt plug inside me, and the bristle-filled cup round my balls, adding to my discomfort. "Come along, Shirley. You have already wasted enough of the day. It is time to get you your bucket and scrubbing brush and start you on your training. I want to make all your muscles ache." Following the tugs from the lead attached to my nose ring and wary of getting more cuts from the painful whalebone switch hanging from Miss Windsor's belt, I docilely followed her towards the scrubbing grounds, in my rustling uncomfortable rubber training uniform. I was about to begin my sentence of servitude and drudgery in the humiliating cap and apron of a housemaid. That night, aching in every muscle, I lay on my hard, rubber-covered bench, wearing my matching color-coordinated rubber sleep apron. It was now 11 o'clock p.m. and it had been a 5.30 start to the day. A very long day, with another 5.30 start scheduled for tomorrow. My neck and wrists were locked into a wooden pillory attached to the head of the bench, and my ankles in a matching pair of stocks at the foot. These had been added during the day, whilst I had been away scrubbing. Legree's luxury holidays indeed. Before locking my wrists, I had been ordered to smooth my apron neatly over my body before sleeping. A large-sized baby's dummy had been strapped into my mouth, to help me sleep. It hadn't so far. It was just another source of discomfort. But the main reason I was still awake were the thoughts churning around in my brain. Yesterday, I had been a moderately successful young accountant in a respectable company, looking forward to my annual holiday. Today, I was a limp bundle of cringing misery as a browbeaten uniformed female skivvy, beaten into submission by a bunch of sadistic, cane-happy females. And, looking forward, all I could see was 10 or 20 years, or even more, of the same, stretching into the far distance. Despite what people said or thought about the abolition of slavery, there was not the slightest doubt that slavery is alive and flourishing in this corner of the world.